good morning, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. So, thank you very much. I am Nabil Tirmizi, Program Manager at AIBD, and I welcome you all on the behalf of AIBD Secretariat. And today we are gathered here for this online media dialogue on safety for journalists. We will be talking on different aspects of it, and we are honored to have been joined by so many media intellects, media gurus from all across the regions. But before that, I would like to invite Director AIBD, Ms. Philomena Nyana Pragasam, a renowned Malaysian journalist and Director of AIBD. Over to you, Madam Philomena.
Thank you, and greetings, everybody. Happy New Year also. I don't think it's too late to wish again. And thank you so much for gathering in this first ever global webinar here, hosted by AIBD and also UNESCO. So I would like to start off by thanking my dear colleague, Dr. Ming Kok, who's also the moderator today. In coming up and assisting us with this global webinar. So we're really grateful. And for AIBD, the mandate for 2021 is looking at two major issues that's currently taken the world by storm. One of it is COVID-19. So we are doing a whole lot of health journalism workshops. And the second one, of course, is safety for journalists. When COVID-19 struck, we were quite shocked to actually see that the footages that we got when we were doing the S.o.p. on COVID was pictures of journalists just going in there to cover one of the provinces that had COVID-19. And nobody knew how to cover, they just went in like that, and then there was no physical distancing, nothing. So they were just happy to go and cover the actual story. And then, the pictures were quite alarming because, they were just exposed. And I think journalists are the first people in the front line who are exposed to these sort of things. And so I think today when we talk about safety for journalists, we're looking at a whole lot of issues, not just war stories, but also today we are facing a new war with an invisible enemy. And so I'm grateful that all the like-minded people are gathered today on Zoom to talk about this. And we're joined by many, many colleagues who are also joining us on Facebook as well as on Zoom from Asia Pacific. And so without much ado, I'd like to hand over the mic to Nabil and then on to beginning our session for today. Thank you once again to all of you who have agreed to come on and join us on this first ever inaugural Safety for Journalists webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Philomena. Now I would like to invite the moderator of this whole show, Dr. Ming Kok Lim. He is Advisor of Communication and Information of UNESCO Jakarta. So, Dr. Ming, over to you. The grade is all yours.
Thank you very much, Nabil. A very good morning and a very good afternoon and evening to everybody joining us today on this online media dialogue on policy matters organized by AIBD with the support from UNESCO as well as the International Program for the Development of Communication. My name is Ming Kwok Lim, the Advisor for Communication and Information for the UNESCO office based in Jakarta. So we know that journalism and journalists are a fundamental component in a democratic society. And more than ever during this COVID-19 pandemic, most of us have looked forward to news reports while our own movement were restricted. Yet journalists face increasing dangers and challenges in the practice of their journalism. Between 2006 to 2019, UNESCO recorded 1,167 journalists and media workers killed because of their work. Importantly, 9 out of 10 cases were never resolved. Additionally, there are non-fatal attacks, including harassment, threats, and other attacks. Women journalists also, they face a gender dimension in their safety. In a recent global survey that UNESCO conducted in 2020, 73% of the women journalists who responded had experienced online violence in their work. A quarter of them had received threats of physical violence. And by now, we know that COVID-19 has wreaked havoc to many industries, including news media. And the coronavirus itself have taken the life of 500 journalists and media workers throughout the globe, according to data from Press Emblem Campaign. Therefore, we are very glad that AIBD is organizing this series of initiatives. And today, this particular dialogue, we'll be looking at how to better understand the current situations regarding safety of journalists, especially linking to COVID-19 situation, and to analyze the significant challenges faced by journalists who are reporting from the field, and to learn from various case studies that we can learn to avoid mistakes and pitfalls so that we will be able to perform better in our jobs. And we are very fortunate today that we are joined by 8 experts from around the world to focus on 5 different areas, specifically preparedness, risk assessment, national policy on disaster management, cybersecurity, psychosocial and mental health, as well as 3 specific case studies from 3 different regions that will shed light on good practices. Each speaker has about 12 minutes maximum to present their thoughts and experience. I'll give a small gentle reminder 1 minute before the time is up. And after which we will have a discussion among the speakers before opening up to the floor for some question and answers. So dear participants, you can at any point you are encouraged to put your questions in the Q&A box, and which we will present it and forward it to the speakers. You may address specific speakers in your question as well if it's relevant. And I hope that we will be able to learn much from our experts today. And without further ado, we can start. But first, perhaps all our speakers could raise and open their camera so everybody can see all our faces for a little while, and the speakers may do a quick wave. Okay, we will have a photo session later on. Now, let's move on. So the first speaker for today is Mr. Alistair Holliton from the United Kingdom, who will be talking to us about the preparedness and risk assessment. Mr. Hollington has over 10 years of experience in the British Army with a full-time role as a medic responsible for all aspects of medical and health care while in the base on exercise and operation. So after leaving the British Army, he has been providing training and recommendations and expert advice to practicing journalists around the world on the issue of safety of journalists, especially how to be better prepared. Now I will let Alistair take over, and Alistair, time is yours.
Thank you. Good day to you all. My name is Alistair. I'm from Lazarus Training, which is a safety training company specialising in safety security training for media workers. First thing I'd like to do is thank the organisers for putting together this event. And I'd also like to thank the attendees for taking the time to join us to discuss this important topic. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to be talking to you about preparation and risk assessment. And obviously, with only a few minutes, I'm going to have to pick out some broad ideas rather than get into very, very fine detail, which perhaps can wait for the discussion later. In many ways, though, that's a good thing because plans have to be broad because the situation is often changing. I would suggest that organisations need to think about their infrastructure as part of their planning. And with this, I don't mean particularly the buildings and power supply and backup studios, though that has to be planned for. What I mean is that resources are allocated to this important topic in advance so that we have money for training, that we have personnel allocated to carry out some of the roles that I'm going to speak about, and also that there is communication within an organisation so that people know what the plan is. I would also suggest that organisations need to prepare their personnel and they need to work on what I'm going to call their resilience. As far as I'm concerned, resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, and they can be catastrophes or just day-to-day difficulties, but we need to work on people's resilience. Now, I would, for convenience, break that resilience down into 3 broad categories. We need to make sure they're physically resilient, mentally resilient, and practically resilient. And there are many other speakers later today who are going to come back to some of these topics. So again, I'll keep my remarks general. So medically screening staff is obviously a difficult topic to consider, but it is one that may well be relevant, particularly for people going on to assignment into difficult areas, such as a post-disaster zone. I would also use this as an example for people covering stories to do with COVID at this moment in time. Fitness of the staff is going to be very context driven. You don't necessarily have to be able to run far, but you do need to be able to get in and out of a vehicle. You do need to be able to carry the equipment. And you do need, for example, to be able to climb the stairs if the elevator in the building is not working. But looking at it through the context of the moment, COVID as a story is not going away anytime soon. And if we were selecting staff to go to a hospital, to go to the ward where people are very, very ill and cover that story, we need to think about the fitness of the staff going there. Is a more senior or mature member of staff with an underlying medical problem the best fit for this? So my words can be used in more than one way there. So we need to do some sort of screening selection of our staff. It doesn't mean that people can't go for things, but we may need to adapt the task to meet their needs. We need to make sure that people are mentally prepared for what they're going to be doing. And I mean this in a number of different ways. We need to make sure people have got the knowledge of what they're going to be doing, where they're going to be deploying to, what they're expected to do. Because any kind of gaps or breakdowns in this will not only make the media workers less effective in the task, but will probably lead to stress for the individual and for the individuals around them. I also think it's important that we prepare people with the skills necessary. We see more and more content providers being asked to create some content that's going to be used on multi-platforms. So do they have the skills to produce something for both radio and for online at the same time? So we have to have the right sort of mindset of how we're putting things together. But they also need to be prepared for the realities of working in the media world. And in the image on my screen here, this is taken from a post-disaster zone. And we have to be aware that there may be death, there may be injury, there may be upset with people. And this is going to work on more than one level. Now, later today, Karen's going to speak about mental health, so I'm not going to talk about this too much. But I think that if people aren't prepared for the reality of what they're going to be seeing, then that is going to have a detrimental effect upon their mental health. But I think we should also be aware of the mental health of people that we're interacting with. If somebody's just had their house destroyed by flooding and 2 members of their family are missing, then the reporter's got to be sensitive for that and perhaps conduct themselves separately. And we need to have prepared that in advance. People will be looking to get the story, not necessarily thinking of the well-being of the contributor. Now, when I mentioned about planning and preparing, most people think about kit, and we can think of the media worker rushing out to cover the breaking news story, grabbing the camera, grabbing body armor maybe, or a life preserver, depending on the situation. And a friend of mine who's a camera operator sent me this picture of the equipment he was taking with him on a 2-week shoot somewhere. And I'm not here to talk about radios and lenses and cameras and so on. But I think people should be prepared about what other equipment do we need. If we're going to be away overnight, or if you're moving away from your normal base, particularly if you're in, again, a post-disaster zone, where are you going to get your water from? Where are you going to get your food from? We need to think about the clothing that we're wearing. Does it protect people from the environment to stop them getting too hot, too cold, keep them dry, whatever that may be? But also, does it look like the police uniform? Does it look like, is there some significance with protesters, with colours and stuff? Is it a good idea to have press on our clothing when we're going to cover a demonstration? So things like these need to be thought about and planned in advance. I mentioned first aid on there. When we do our safety training for media workers, most people sort of say, yes, we have a first aid kit. But many of them have never looked in it in the 4 or 5 years they've been carrying it around. So we need to make sure that we both equip people but that we know how they use it. And training may well be part of that, whether it's face-to-face, online, whatever it may be. But we can't just assume that people know how to use equipment. And that's particularly true with safety equipment. So risk assessment is going to sit at the middle of all this. And a lot of people feel a pain when we mention risk assessment, but it's not meant to stop people doing things. It's meant to be an enabler to allow people to do things safely. Now, there are many different formats for risk assessment, and so I'm just going to talk about some broad principles. But we carry out risk assessments all the time. When we go to cross the local road or highway and we look at the traffic to decide if it's safe to cross, I would argue that's a risk assessment. So one typical format for a risk assessment, and some media organisations will have templates for this, and I would encourage that the people can fill in at the time. But one of the important aspects of who fills it in is it needs to be someone who understands the assignment. Now, they can be done in advance. They can be done as what we call generic, that, okay, we're going to the Parliament building to interview somebody on the step. You could produce a generic risk assessment for that and reuse, having reviewed it multiple times. But the person completing the risk assessment needs to have that understanding of the task. But at the same time, we need management to take responsibility and have oversight of it. So there's often a two-step process to risk assessment. And if the organisation is big enough to have a safety department, it may even become a three-step process. But the process will normally look something like this. We need to identify what is the hazard, what is the risk that we're talking about now. Now, you could spend forever coming up with all sorts of diverse risks. That's not the idea. We have to work backwards from the most likely things. Who is at risk? What if this thing happened, who would it affect? Would it affect all members of our team? Would it affect one member of the team? And so on. If the bad thing happened, what would it actually do? We then have to do quite a difficult thing. We have to do a sort of a judgment of how likely is it to happen. And sometimes these last two, what could happen and how likely it is, are merged together to be a scoring system that's sometimes referred to as severity and likelihood. We then look at, well, what is already in place? And many times there are actually control measures in place. But then we should always look at, can we do more and how we're going to action that? Now, if we use an example for this to put it into play, hopefully it will all link up a little bit better. So one of the big risks I personally feel to media workers when they're out on assignment is the risk of being in a vehicle accident, a car crash, a road traffic collision, a road traffic accident, whatever you wish to call it. And so if we use that same system to break it down, well, what is the hazard? Well, the hazard is that we could be involved in a car accident. Who is at risk? Well, it's going to be everybody in the vehicle. But half the people that are killed in road accidents aren't actually in a vehicle, they're pedestrians, cyclists, and so on. So we should really spread it and say, well, our staff are at risk, but so are the general public. Well, what could happen if our staff are in a road accident? Well, this shows the thing about we have to think it all through step by step. At one end of the spectrum, people could die. There's people die every few seconds in road traffic accidents across the world. At the other end of the spectrum, they may just be delayed, which means they miss the appointment to interview the minister. They miss the internal flight, so they don't then carry on with assignments. So there's quite a broad a series of events that could happen in this case, and we have to work out what's important and what we can then, how likely is it to happen. Now, the reason I've got this image on the screen for you is this comes from the World Health Organization, who collect data. And what I'm trying to illustrate is there'll be different data sources you want to access to get this kind of information. And the World Health Organization have looked at all the countries across the world that have provided them with data, which is most of them. And you can then look at how high or low the risk is. Now, this isn't some horrible kind of league system, we're better than you. The reality behind road traffic deaths is a complex mix of infrastructure, vehicles, driving habits, and medical response. But it would give you an idea of, is the risk increasing, decreasing, how likely is it? Now, we then get to our final two questions for the model that I've talked about. Many risk assessment models would have many, many more questions. But what is already being done? Well, maybe a large organization has its own vehicles. Maybe it has assigned drivers. Maybe it has a contract with a hire company. Maybe you have a fixer driver that you know works in that area. So you can look at things like reducing the amount of driving any one individual has to do, making sure vehicles are maintained and so on. But there's always that question, can we do more? And one easy win that I would suggest, which isn't always practical, but I would recommend where possible, is perhaps putting in rules such as we don't drive at night time. Now, many accidents occur during the day, but many of them are just damage only. Many of the big, bad, fatal accidents happen at night time. So if we don't drive at night time, maybe we've already reduced the risk. Maybe we put in a policy that you can only drive for 2 hours at a time or 100 kilometers before you must take a break to avoid fatigue, which is often a contributory factor to accidents. So I've tried to use road traffic deaths as an example because this is a risk to us all. I'm from the UK, but currently sitting in Ukraine, and people from across the world are joining us for this event. We all have this same problem. The degree of it varies from country to country. But I've used it as an example to show that method of risk assessment. And I would urge all organisations to start carrying out risk assessments and review existing risk assessments in advance as part of that planning. But there is a problem. No plan lasts forever. Mike Tyson, the American boxer, is often attributed with a saying, we all have a plan until we get punched in the face. And I think media workers, both literally and metaphorically, are at a high risk of that punch in the face moment. To stick with America and use another example, only a couple of weeks ago, a rally run by the then President Donald Trump outside the White House, and there's an image here on the screen. That rally, which media workers were covering, then evolved into public disorder, rioting, whatever you wish to call it, which led to deaths of people. And as we all saw, I was sitting there watching it sort of live on TV at home. Media workers were targeted during this as well. Equipment was damaged and people were attacked. So the planning is great. We must do that before they go out the door. We must quickly review it to see if the circumstances have changed. But we must have a mechanism by which people can carry out a new risk assessment on the ground. And that is what I mean by dynamic risk assessment. Again, there's different systems that can be used, but we need to know what will happen on the ground, how will they reassess the risk. And it's important that the newsroom, the office, and the people in the field have an understanding of how this works. Now, I think I'm probably getting very close to the end of my time.
You have exceeded the time, Alistair.
Oh, sorry. But very quickly then, just final moments is there's more to this planning. And what I would highlight here is a communication plan. And what I mean by that is that the office and the field team must be able to communicate. They must know how it's done. Is it phone? Is it radio? Is it sat phone? What number do I call? What number do I call at 2 a.m. when the hotel's burnt down and I'm outside? How do I do that? Have I got a backup charger? And also, like, what happens if I don't call? Many assignments you would say, okay, we're going to check in every 2 hours, every 6 hours, every day. But what will the newsroom do if you don't call in? And that needs to be understood by both sides. And you might need to think about transport, and you might need to think about emergency plans. But the key thing that I would suggest is that we do need to plan. We need to review existing plans, and those plans need to be understood by all parties. Because as the saying goes, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So thank you for your time. Apologies for going over. Hopefully I'm not setting a precedent for all the other speakers today. And thank you for your time.
1 minute over. So thank you very much, Alistair, for your presentation on preparedness and risk assessment. And certainly we should all be physically, mentally, and practically prepared whenever we go on assignment and to do any work. Now let's move on to Matt Brown, who is the Deputy Editor for ABC Australia, who will be also talking about the same area on preparedness and risk assessment. But as he is the Deputy Editor for the international news at ABC, perhaps he would also be providing us a little bit more from his perspective from his current position as an editor. So the floor is yours, Matt.
Thanks a lot. Thanks to AIBD and UNESCO for organising this. Thanks everyone for joining us. I look forward to learning from the other panelists and from all of you. So I was on the road for 13 years before I came back to Australia, and I've been the Deputy International Editor for 2 years. So when Filomena was talking about the footage of people heading off to cover the COVID-19 outbreak, I was the one who sent our guys from Beijing down into to Wuhan. So that's my job, to try and to do that with them and to do it as safely as possible. Basically, we work in the framework that you were hearing Alistair talk about, and I'll run you through how we do it as an example of how that framework is put into practice. I'm going to share my screen with you. So I don't talk about doing things safely. I talk about doing more safely, safer. There are no absolutes in this game. Nothing is safe, except perhaps sitting here in Sydney. So in Australia, we have legislation, good legislation. It's the Work Health and Safety Act. At the extreme, company officers can face criminal charges if they don't do all that's required to look after the safety of their workers. Of course, under that, it creates a series of policies in big organisations like the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Companies have to do these sorts of things. Provide safe workplaces are obvious, but also provide training to manage the risks, which is a lot of what Alistair was getting at, to ensure that there's a culture of health, safety and well-being. And it's important also, under the legislation here, employees also have obligations. So they have to do things like follow the systems that you put in place, don't hurt themselves, don't hurt others. And this is a big one from my time in the field. I know how hard it is to get people to do this, to report safety issues. So if you're in the field thinking, oh, this is no good, this isn't safe, it's your job, and certainly here in Australia, it's a legislative requirement for you to tell your employer that those things are unsafe and need to be dealt with. And that's what I started to do when I came into this position, was to create a constant cycle of communication. So everything from planning to go out on a job to saying this isn't working, this is what we need to address, to debriefing when you come back, so that there's a culture of sharing information. We provide training and support. So every person who goes on assignment for the ABC now has gone through a hostile environment awareness training course, which is the kind of thing that organisations like Alistair's provide. They cover off over 5 days, things like first aid, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, but also some of the more detailed approaches that you were just hearing about actually planning to go into particular common threat environments like natural disasters or armed conflict. And that goes for every staff member. So our locally engaged staff in bureaus, the local bureau producers, they also go through this training. Basically, anyone we expect to be in the field for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, employed by us, has gone through that training. In the office, we also ensure that we have management controls like managing the workload, making sure that people aren't run ragged. We'll squeeze blood out of a stone, of course, but we are very conscious that you've done that for a day, it's time to take a different approach, or to make sure that it's mixed and matched through the team. That goes with exposure to trauma, which is something I'm sure Karen will talk about later. You know, people dealing with a lot of user-generated content these days, a lot of videos coming out of conflict zones or going into environments which are very confronting, and having a 20-hour workload on top of that. We just make sure we're conscious of that. We either space that workload out, give people a rest, or we swap staff in and out. And each one of our people going out of Australia is actually assigned a counsellor. So there's confidential support to every one of those people if they want to take that up. I like this. It's from the realm of risk management. We don't need to worry too much about it. But the reason I like it is this bit down the bottom here, the red tip of the pyramid, protective equipment. We're going to a war zone. What's the first thing we think about? Have we got a flak jacket? Have we got a helmet? It's really important, but it's the least reliable thing we can do. And so what I do, and what I started doing a lot when I came into this position, is to push a lot of the thinking, a lot of the consideration up that pyramid. And also you start eliminating risk before it hits you, before you're standing there and all you've got is a so-called bulletproof vest and someone's pointing a gun at you. There are a whole lot of other things you can be doing to make sure you don't end up in that situation. Start at the top there. I won't read through this, but start at the top, eliminating the hazard. So let's deal with COVID-19. Do you need to go to a COVID-19 sufferer? Is it possible to do a Skype interview with them or to talk to them through some other digital platform on their phone? I'll use that as just the main example. Eliminating and substituting. You know, we've traditionally in big organizations like the ABC spend a lot of money, a lot of time sending camera crews to people. It's important. Being there is why we're all in this game, right? And we never would have really wanted to put on TV someone's selfie video of them going about their daily business in their house. Yuck. But actually what happened with COVID-19 is that became the only way we were going to get that footage. And it allowed us to achieve a really intimate glimpse of people's lives, something we just couldn't have done in previous iterations where we were making appointments, sending camera crews. So it's just an example of how this risk management process and risk mitigation process can actually lead to good outcomes at the same time. So there are a whole bunch of different ways of eliminating risk, doing something different, isolating the risk. A simple thing at protests, look around for barriers, use retaining walls, use things between you and people who might be violent. All of that does work within that sort of bureaucratic risk management framework. Speaking of bureaucracy, this is a snapshot of the ABC's COVID-19 risk assessment matrix. It's pretty long, isn't it? But it's detailed, and detailed for a reason. It's about 2.5 pages long when you boil it down. And what we decided is essentially we need to tell people it takes longer. So with COVID-19, we're monitoring staff health, we're screening talent, we're asking people before we go and interview or film them, do they have symptoms, for example? We're making sure that crews are drilled on practicing social distancing whilst they're news gathering. That includes things like trying to only have 2 people in a vehicle, making sure the windows are down, of course, cleaning equipment and practicing personal hygiene. On assignment, we've decided that it's going to take longer. It's also going to cost more. So we ask journalists to find out the infection rates at their destination. We ask them what the rules are upon their return. There are places where you have been to a hotspot, you come back, you've got to isolate for 2 weeks and get a COVID test. We're doing that anyway. Basically anywhere, anytime one of our staff travels for work now, they are coming back and getting a COVID test and having no contact with the rest of the team until their results are known. If they think they've been a close contact of someone infected, of course, they're having no contact with the rest of the community either. Time and money, it comes down to a commitment. We're looking for direct flights if possible. So sometimes you could get there more quickly or cheaper by taking connecting flights. We're prioritizing direct flights. We're looking for assigned seatings. All of our staff are wearing masks and face shields when they're traveling. They're using the concept of having outdoor clothes. So clothes that they go out to that Trump rally, for example, they come back, and if they were on assignment in DC, instead of being based there, there's another hotel room where they have pre-positioned clean clothes, and they go into that hotel room, they take off those dirty clothes and put them in a bag. They get in the shower, have a shower, clean the place down, and put their clean clothes on and exit. So in that way, they're not trying not to take virus-covered clothing into their accommodation. And as I said, they're isolating and testing upon return. So that's the sort of COVID-19 phase of it. I'll wrap up in a couple of minutes. My time's running out. We also have a series of standard tasks which we ask people to have a look at. And I feature them more to point out what we emphasize. So out of that big long list, you know, there are some things about working with animals. I've highlighted there in yellow, checking if your crew has allergies or phobias. And the point is that we're encouraging the whole team to have a discussion and to conduct a risk assessment. Often, still, it's the journalist, we're going here, we're going over the barricades, and everybody else is expected to follow along. So we're encouraging people to talk about it as a group and review the plan together. We're also making sure that timing and resourcing suits the risks. Not, we've got to do this cheaply and we've got to get it done fast. That's true, but we are saying, look, if we're acknowledging risks, then we're going to hire extra local support staff. We're going to hire an extra vehicle. If we're in a hostile environment, we're getting stuck with a broken down car, could mean the difference between life and death. We're coughing up the extra cash. Getting to a site to do a recce in advance if possible is another example of that. Aviation, I use this because we want realistic means. So the existing risk matrix had a whole lot of stuff about obtaining all this documentation from someone before you get in an aircraft. And any of us who've been anywhere in the world beyond somewhere like Sydney know that you've got Buckleys of getting that. So we've converted that into just helpful points that you could try. Ask questions about what kind of route it is, what kind of provider it is. So we take those risk controls, and there's lots of them out there on the web, and we've made them into more realistic things that people can try and do when they've got 1 or 2 hours before they decide to get on a helicopter in Pakistan and fly up into the Hindu Kush. I'm going to leave it there because I want to make sure everyone's got time to talk through their presentations and also to take questions from you. But there's a lot more to say about that process of taking the formal risk mitigation doctrine and a lot of the kind of things that risk managers want and making them into realistic things that people can do in the field. And I'll wrap it up there.
Thank you so very much, Matt, for your very insightful presentation and a lot of first-hand information. And the one particular component that I thought was very important, and perhaps we can discuss this later during the discussion time, is the building the culture of health, safety, and well-being, and the sharing of information, even to the level of detail whether the crew has a specific allergy or phobia towards certain animals. So those kind of things are quite interesting. Thank you so much. And now let's move on to our next speaker, Professor Surya Prakash, the consultant for disaster preparedness in India, who will be sharing with us some information on national policy on disaster management. And okay, there you go. And Professor, the time is yours. Dr. Surya, are you there? Yes, Dr.
Hello.
Surya, your camera is on and we can hear you. Please,
Okay.
The time is yours.
Can you see my presentation now?
Yes,
is my screen visible?
To put it on.
Okay. Yeah. Actually, my previous speakers, Dr. Ming has already highlighted the need for disaster management in the media sector because many media personnel has also been affected by the disaster situations. And the previous speakers, Alistair and Matt, has also emphasized on risk assessment, preparedness, and awareness. So what I will be talking about, how in the field of disaster management at the national, regional, and international levels, we have been preparing for the safety of media sector. So looking into the disaster situations, as you know, these are emerging, enhancing, and increasing in time, frequency, and area coverage. So this is what I have shown through a graph for the 20 years from 80 to 99 and also 2000 to 2019. So because of our more interventions with that. Now I'm just saying that in order to cover the news in the disaster areas, our journalists, reporters, they are going there without information regarding the steps for their own security and safety in that field. So while we are talking about that, we have to actually look into that, not only their safety in the field, but also in their media houses and broadcast houses to be ensured. So I will talk in terms of safety of the media houses, in terms of the broadcast houses to be designed, constructed and maintained for proper safety if they are located in any hazardous locality. Risk assessment is very well developed and matured at this time, and we are able to assess the risks to different elements that exist within an hazardous area. So we are assessing the physical risks, we are assessing the psychological risk, and we are also assessing the risk to the infrastructure and other measures. For that, we have to see that do we provide the adequate information to our journalists and reporters going to the site, so that what are the steps to be taken up. For example, I give you one example. Matt has just mentioned the common alert protocol in terms of red, orange, yellow and green symbols. So what are the actions to be taken by the media personnel if they are going to an area which is signaled as red or an area signaled as orange? So we have to actually educate them, we have to provide them adequate training and also equipment to protect themselves in disaster situations. So at present, we don't have those situations. And also in terms of the psychological impacts, these reporters are getting exposed. A suggestion has also been made to have a counselor, but their self-care in terms of psychological well-being can also be managed through training programs. The other is in terms of the employers and employee situations. No doubt, the individuals by themselves cannot take care of their safety well without support from the institutions. So in terms of institutions, we have actually the disaster management institutions which provide all the resources and information that what are the likely hazards in a particular geographical area and how the safety precautions, do's and don'ts can be taken up by the media personnel. So their exposures can be reduced. We have a lot of examples. For example, I give you a case. In 1984, in first week of December, 1st and 2nd of December, we had Bhopal gas tragedy, which actually released methyl isocyanide, a toxic gas, and people were not well aware to protect themselves from that poisonous gas impacts. If they had known that how they can save themselves, even if there is a gas, toxic gas in the environment, then most of the lives could have been saved. So this was the case even with the media reporters as well. Similarly, in other cases, for example, in earthquakes and tsunami, or also the flood cases, this has been happening. So the unusual challenges that the reporters are facing during the coverage have to be actually well informed before time so that they can take adequate cautions and go to the field with full preparedness and requirements of that particular situation. So other thing that we are concerned in the disaster management field is our media reporters have dual role. One, that they are going there and exposing themselves to the risk. Second is that they are making reports and saving the lives of the people through dissemination of the information and the news. So they actually sometimes are following up wrong information and spreading sometimes fake news and rumors, which also need to be taken care, which becomes cause for chaos and panic among the public. So I would say that the reporters are not only the first responders, but also the saviors of the people's lives in terms of their information. If it is correctly and fact-based, it will help the public. Finally, I would say that our organizations, which I am putting up from including the opinion of other experts, have also given the risk assessment techniques. Asia Disaster Prevention Center had proposed the three phases of safety and preparedness in disaster situation. That is, before the deployment in the disaster situation, during the deployment in the disaster situation, and post deployment. What are the actions to be taken up? So they have actually said that we can prepare the risk assessment. So whatever areas you are covering, we must know what is the likelihood of risk, the magnitude, scale, level, and spread is very much important and should be known to the reporters who are going to those areas. Second, they should also have a checklist of their safety measures, that is in terms of personal protective equipment, in terms of their knowledge and skills to save themselves in those situations. So they can have first aid kit, what has been suggested, CPR or PPs and so on, or electronic devices to communicate with the people if they get trapped in an adverse situation or a catastrophic situation. Second, it is very important to be mentally very sound in those situations. Some people, they can get even perturbed and mentally upset at those time or stressed. That will actually bring more risks. So therefore, they have to be made strong in those situations to reduce their stresses and anxiety in the disaster situations. The second is when they are at the site. Even the reporters and journalists are human beings. They also get affected by the sufferings of the human beings at the site. So they also have social and psychological impacts. So while entering, they have to know whether they can be allowed to enter in that site or not, and if it is safe or not, because there were instances in a case of particularly earthquakes where aftershocks had happened and our reporters got caught into that and they got killed just because in order to cover those events. Then reassessing the situations, that as told by Alistair, that it is dynamic risk. It changes over time. So the risk situation can be changing, may become more adverse or less adverse. So we have to assess at the time when we are visiting and reassess your own mental and emotional well-being. So they should become cool. They should understand, think, assess, and then act. Then only they can save themselves. After the coverage, there should be an exit strategy, because people who have actually visited there, they have been actually emotionally affected covering the scenes. So they should be given proper counseling and their workload and stress should be minimized by the employers or by their colleagues or the counselors. And in case there is a trauma, some professional help can also be given. So we have in our society, our post-traumatic stress disorders, which can also happen amongst the journalists, which need to be taken care. So there is other issue which I am just talking, being a president of International Association for Promoting Geoethics, that ethical aspects in terms of communication in the media must be taken care, and they should be properly guided that what to be reported and what not to be reported in a disaster situations, so that the risks are not aggravated at that time. And populations which are affected, they do not get more affected. So this is what actually I wanted to communicate, that as said by Alistair also, that physical, mental and practical, all kinds of trainings are required. What I propose that AIBD may think of having a media safety center for training on disaster situations. And this media safety center should actually look into the physical safety of the media houses, human resources, as well as the infrastructure and equipments that are deployed in the field, so that the work can continue and they can continue their reports without getting affected by that. So it is important to assess a disaster situation well. Before you go there, train them on disaster risk reduction and resilience with adequate awareness, preparedness for disaster coverage. enforce good professional safety standards, practices, policies, guidelines, plans, and regulations. We do have national policies on disaster management, but sectoral policies are very much required, keeping into the work environment and occupational standards and practices. Also, the regulations, what should be done and what should not be done, and capacity enhancement of all the people and the institutions. Safety training must be the heart of all efforts to enhance the safety of media around the world. Coordinated and collaborative efforts with all concerned should be the way of approach. So with that, I close this, that in disaster management, we have a target for safety, health, and quality of life on an equitable and a justifiable manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Surya, and thank you for setting the alarm yourself.
Yeah,
I have
actually,
an alarm over here as well with a. So that's great. Thank you so much for that presentation. Indeed, journalists are also human, and that is something that we should always keep in mind, and to be able to know that it is okay to seek help when you need the help. And that is something very important as well to build into our understanding. So from that perspective into disasters and mental health a little bit, now we move on a little bit to the cyber side with Philip Victor, who is a consultant on cybersecurity based in Malaysia, I think. And Philip will be discussing with us some issues pertaining to cybersecurity. The time is yours, Philip.
Thank you, Dr. Ming. Let me share my screen. So good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. And first of all, I'd like to thank AIBD for inviting us to speak on this very important topic. Just a very quick introduction to who we are, as I don't come from a journalism background, but just to give you an idea, we are an organization that is basically doing a lot of work on strategic advisory and focusing a lot on connectivity. And I personally look after the cybersecurity portion of it. And we are a ITU sector member, so we work with the ITU a lot on helping countries to build up their critical infrastructure strategies and protecting their critical infrastructures as well. Okay, so that's just a quick overview of it. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is in the area of digital safety. You have heard from the previous three speakers where they talk a lot about physical security. Digital safety is also very much related to what we just heard this now, except that this is just in the form of, in a digital form. And we are seeing a lot of things happening in the digital world today. I think a lot of you have been hearing also, like recently, WhatsApp has talked about, you know, how they are changing their policy. Everybody is shifting out of WhatsApp, you know, because of the fear of being monitored, data being compromised, and so on and so forth. So I'll just take you through some of the things that we are looking at, the threats that we are seeing, what kind of threats we are seeing, especially for journalists. And then we'll look at some of the recommendations, some of the policies that we can look at, and how to safeguard ourselves. Okay, so I'm not going to give you a lot of statistics because I believe a lot of you come from the journalist background, so you have a lot of statistics in hand. I just pulled out this from the UNESCO publishing document, which was back in 2013, actually. The reason I'm just pulling this out is just to show you that even back then, they've already said this, the number of online journalists has increased, so attacks against them, such as illegal hacking, monitoring, and arrest, detentions, blocking of websites are all also increasing. So whether we like it or not, we are living in a very connected world, and we see a lot of organizations are going into the digital world today. So as we move into the digital world, we are going to see a lot more of this kind of things happening. So, so when we talk about digital safety, sometimes we call it digital safety, sometimes we call it online safety or internet safety, it doesn't matter. We're talking about on the digital world itself. When we go onto the digital realm, then we are going to be facing with a lot of threats. So from what I see is that, you know, a lot of journalists now are moving into the digital world, and it definitely brings a lot of good benefits to the journalists in terms of speed, accuracy, efficiency, and so on. But unfortunately, there are also a lot of threats and also a lot of challenges. Sometimes we don't know whether where or what is safe anymore. I myself, you know, I feel, you know, it's very challenging for myself as well, because there is no silver bullet to fight this. We have to take a multi-pronged approach towards protecting ourselves. But I'm going to give you the best I can from my over 20 years of experience, what we see and how we can at least protect ourselves to a certain level, to protect our privacy, to protect from online dangers and the harms that come together while accessing the digital world. So what are the threats that we see in terms of digital threats? So when we talk about digital threats today, we see that there are a lot of things. I've just put some of it here, but you know, if you want to list down the whole list of things, there are a lot of threats. But these are the common ones that we see. The common threats that we face today, things like digital surveillance. Digital surveillance is increasing. A lot of countries have stepped up in terms of digital surveillance. We see that, you know, there's a huge amount of surveillance going on, and also for the very fact that storage capabilities have become very cheap. Today we see that, you know, if you take 20 years ago, storage was very, very expensive. And today, because storage is so cheap, people are able to do things like, you know, digital surveillance in a very, very large extent. Then, of course, we have the attack technology. Today, we have very sophisticated tools and very simple tools. Even a kid in high school today can pick up a tool and attack a website, attack a bank. I personally, over the years, have worked a lot in terms of working with the law enforcement. I've done a lot of work with the law enforcement. I've done a lot of work with Interpol, and we have done, you know, a lot of investigative work in terms of looking at criminals. And a lot of times that, you know, we have found criminals to be very, very young. We are talking about teenagers, and you know, these are people like 13 years old, 15 years old, who have used simple tools and to hack banks, to hack organizations. So digital technology is there. It's made available online. Hackers are putting up tools online for free. They are giving them steps, methods on how to go and hack as well. And we see that in terms of hacking, we're looking at, you know, social media being a huge target today. So much so that, you know, people are afraid now that is social media a safe place? Is it not a safe place? What can be put up there? What cannot be put up there? What kind of information can be gathered on social media? And this is what has happened recently with WhatsApp, knowing that it's owned by Facebook, and Facebook also owns Instagram, WhatsApp, you know, so people are becoming, you know, a bit more cautious, like what are they harvesting? And if you do not go and change the security default settings, you will see that it actually by default collects quite a bit of information. So, so sometimes we have to know that there are these media accounts out there, but how do we use it in terms of protecting ourselves? You know, how do we change the privacy settings? How do we change the kind of data that it harvests, and so on? Phishing is something. Phishing and social engineering I've personally highlighted because these are some of the two very, very active attacks that is happening in the world today. Phishing being, you know, where they send you an email posing to be something else, and looks exciting to you. And today, criminals are using very sophisticated method. They do a lot of background checks. So they send you relevant phishing emails. They send you emails that, something that you would want to open. They see, okay, this person does this thing. They've done some background check, and they send you, those kind of targeted emails. And then, how they harvest data from there. Social engineering, like, people just do a basic thing like, coming and asking you some simple questions, and then you think it's just a casual talk. And then they are actually, they have ways, they are well trained on how to ask the right questions to get the right kind of information. It's just like how you are as a journalist. Social engineering, social engineers uses the same method as well. So coming up with this kind of information is very easy. We have done live social engineering during a hacking conference where, we just pick randomly people out from the audience, and we've asked them several questions, and then we could guess their passwords from there, because people tend to use passwords that they can remember, like dates and, names of people, like their wives or their family members, their pets, and so on. Okay, moving on. Other things that are very, very crucial we need to understand are things like digital location tracking technologies. Today we have, things like geolocation tracking. I want to show you an example later. It may not be during this presentation because I don't have much time, but it may be done at the end, where I will show you how you can do a simple thing as like, removing geo tracking from pictures that you take, because many people don't know that photos that you take on your mobile phone has got so much of information that is tied to it. And one of it is geolocation. So we'll see like things like that, how to, when you understand what can be done, you can better protect yourselves. We've got fake domain attacks today. Nowadays, people are creating domains that look exactly like the real thing. Data mining, where they are pulling out information, privacy stuff, your personal data. A lot of apps that you install, a lot of software that you install by default, it gives them access to personal information, contact books, address books, and so on. How do you remove all these things? So you need to know, you need to understand. Denial of service attack, or what they call as a DOS attack, where they bring down your servers and stuff like that so that you can't do your work. Online harassment is increasing a lot. How people are doing online harassment today is because they are able to mine a lot of data about you. The less they know, the harder it is to become, and that's something we need to understand. Now, these are some of the challenges we see, not only to journalists, but to anybody out there who's not an IT savvy person or not a very IT savvy person. They probably have sometimes, they just have a basic knowledge of IT. These are some of the challenges. There are a lot of security tools out there, but I agree with a lot of people. There are a lot of unfriendly security tools. Which one is a good one? Which one is easy to use? Which one is effective? So these are challenges for choosing the right security tools. Are they really, really good security tools? High cost of the security tools, because if you buy tools today, it's very expensive. Open source, on the other hand, if we go for it, though it's free or cheap, it becomes obsolete over time because nobody then maintains it over the time. And then we see a lot of financial losses to organization because of cyber attacks. And secure communication is a very, very important thing. How do we choose the right secure communication when we deal, especially when we deal with our sources or we'll deal with our HQ and so on. So some of the recommendations that I have is, these are some of the things how to protect yourself. First of all, do some research on secure communication. I personally use Wire for my work. Okay, I use WhatsApp, but those are mostly for leisure work. You can go for Signal. There's Wire. I'm not promoting anything. I'm just giving you examples. DuckDuckGo is basically a secure, most private browser to use if you want to be more secure in terms of your searches and all that.
Philip, sorry
yes.
to interrupt. Would you mind wrapping it up?
Yeah, sure. Then, of course, encryption, multi-factor authentications are very important. Don't use anything that's only got a single authentication, and disable geo-tracking whenever you can. Okay. I think this one, you can read it from the slides later, will be made available. Risk assessments have been talked a lot, and how to choose the right security tools here. I'm more than happy to follow up with anybody on that. So my last thing that I want to say is, the more connected you are, the more exposed you become. So you need to be smart, you need to be cautious, and always remember, less is always better. Don't give out too much information out. And I said the example I'm going to show you, I will show you at the end, when we have the at the end of the program later on. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, Dr. Ming, for a little bit running late, and hand it back over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Philip. And I'm sure the organizer will also be sharing your slides with everyone, so they will have a copy and all the information. And in truthfulness, all this needs a bit of time to digest and practice. So it's not something that can be done over a single presentation. And that's just the way it is. But now, from the digital realm, we would like to go back to our mental health. And who better than to let us know a little bit more about psychosocial and mental health than Ms. Karen Percy, the chairperson of DART Asia Pacific, who has been doing a lot of work on the issue of mental health, trauma, especially with journalists. So without further ado, the time is yours, Karen. And you might need to unmute yourself. I don't think we can hear you, Karen.
Hello, hello.
Okay, now it's good.
Okay, great. So I'm going to just get on to my PowerPoint presentation here. Thank you, everybody, for being able to be here. This is really fabulous. I think it's a wonderful presentation. I've certainly learned a lot, and I've been really thrilled to hear so many of our speakers talk about not just the physical security, safety side of things, but the mental health side of things as well. So I'm really thrilled about that. I'm a journalist of well over 30 years experience. I've actually worked along with Matt Brown and was a foreign correspondent with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation at one stage. I left the ABC several months ago, and I'm now the chair of the DART Centre Asia Pacific. The DART Centre started in the United States, but has moved to Europe and Asia Pacific, and it focuses on journalism and media workers and trauma. So it specifically looks at research, best practice, and really looking at this in a very close way. So here's a bit of me over my career over the last sort of 10, 20 years. I was in Bangkok for a number of years, where there was a coup in 2006 and there was unrest for a lot of years. I also got to Malaysia on a bilateral visit.
Karen, sorry to interrupt. I don't think the slides are moving and it's not full screen yet.
Oh, okay. Oh, it says it's paused. Resume share. Okay.
And to have it full screen, perhaps?
Yeah. We did actually check this. Sorry, can you still see that? No?
We are now back to, no, we can't see the screen. Karen Percy has started sharing the screen, but it is still blank at the moment.
Miss Karen, just stop sharing and start the slideshow first, and then you can share the screen.
Got you. Thank you. Apologies for that.
No problem. It will not count towards your 12 minutes. Do not worry.
Okay. Now I can't see how to get onto you to see the... Is anybody seeing that yet? No? I can't now see you. I can't get to... Now that I've started it. Okay.
You would need to select the screen, I think.
Sorry, I need to... Let's try and share.
Ms. Karen, I think I can start your presentation.
Okay.
Right. Or maybe I can share your presentation.
Yeah, sure. Chef, you do that. Yeah, and I'll just let you know when to move. I'm so sorry.
Sure.
We did have this sorted before. Always works out this way, doesn't it?
All right. All right.
No problem.
All righty. So thank you so much, Nabil. So you've heard me talk about, so we'll go to the next slide, which shows a little bit of my career. There was a great deal of unrest in Thailand where we were constantly at a low level of constant violence in Bangkok in those 3 years. Down on the right-hand side bottom, I was also in Russia, in Moscow, when some of those anti-government, anti-Putin protests began back in the 2010s. Next slide, please. So when we think about trauma and journalists, what's really surprising in the research is actually that there are high levels of exposure to trauma in journalism, somewhere in the order of 86 to 98%, depending on the research you look at. That's because, as we've heard from other speakers, we're very often the first on the scene. So there's that first responder kind of a thing that kicks in. There's also a very strong macho culture in the media sector, let's face it. So sometimes that means there's little organisational support when it comes to psychological issues, and oftentimes little understanding. We're getting better at it, but we still have those issues. So next slide, please there, Nabil. So when we, these are what we call potential traumatic events, and they can happen from a threat to life, natural disasters, extreme violence, sexual violence. They can be direct exposure where you're there at the scene where, you know, 4 policemen have died after a truck crossed a road and killed them, or it can be vicariously through your work. Next slide, please. One of the really interesting examples of this in recent years, certainly that I've experienced, next slide. Thanks, Nabil, is on the left-hand side, that's George Pell. He's the Cardinal of Australia, very big deal in the Catholic Church in the Vatican, who faced historical sexual offence charges and was in fact convicted at that time. And then subsequently his conviction has been quashed. I've been a court reporter in recent years. I covered some of George Pell, not all of George Pell, but that case was one that threw up so much in the way of psychological issues for journalists, for the victims involved, even if they weren't necessarily of these alleged offences. But George Pell in Australia was a very senior figure in the Catholic Church who oversaw a lot of pedophile priests. He claims that he didn't know very much about what was going on, but the harm that was done during that story with the constant reporting of it was very, very deep indeed. So it's not just when you're out there seeing something, you know, right before you. The number of times I've sort of listened to difficult testimony or had to deal with victims is very, very difficult. And there's me on the bottom right-hand side wearing my pussy hat a couple of years ago on International Women's Day, where I was doing our radio news that day. But, you know, people on the desk situation who are getting information in can also be traumatized as well. Now, Bill, if we can have the next slide, that would be great. So who might be affected? Obviously those on the scene. And when you're talking internationally, that's fixers, that's translators, it's drivers, it's technical operators. So don't forget about that expanded team you have. There are, of course, those who are watching graphic images, listening to sounds as they come in. Editors, archivists, remembering somebody has to put this in your library. They're having to watch that as well or listen to it. And people on the news desk at base having to deal with you who might be going through some difficulties. Also those with responsibility, editors, assignments, staff, management and team leaders can be really impacted as well. They worry about their staff and they worry they're doing the right thing. Your wider social support, family, friends, work colleagues can often be affected by what you are doing. We know that it's hard to kind of pull apart the personal and the professional. And of course, anybody with an affinity or a connection with the story. That was certainly the case with George Pell. It just really was one of those difficult, difficult stories. Now, Bill, please, the next slide. So when we look at the factors that might affect a trauma response, there are a number of them. It's the nature of the exposure. We talk about the type. It might be a natural disaster, a bomb, or some kind of personal violence. The proximity, how close are you to that particular event, and the duration. How long are you being exposed to it? Is this something that you're there just for a day, or is this something for a week, or is it an investigation that you're doing for months and months on end? These all can have an impact on how much you're traumatized or how much you take on some of the trauma that you're dealing with. The time between events, we know that newsrooms are not staffed in the way they used to be. So you've got fewer and fewer journalists, and that means they are more than likely doing difficult, traumatic, potentially traumatic events more and more often. What kind of team and support and leadership that you have? The Australian Broadcasting Corporation has an extensive peer support program. And as Matt has shown you, there's, a great deal of effort and thought going into try and protect people. That's not the case in all organisations. We'd like it to be, but it's not there yet. So it's also about individual resilience and, your individual experience, how you grew up, what your personal circumstances were. And then the presence of other stresses. One of the things when I talk to journalists about how they've been affected by an event, so much of what they first want to talk to me about is my battery failed, the line went down before that live cross, we didn't get to the press conference in time, and our rival network got that interview. Or it might be, you're not sleeping well because you're in an earthquake zone or you're in a flood. So those other kind of stresses and strains that just add to all of the tensions that you have, as well as, of course, trying to get your story done. So Nabil, can we have the next slide as well, please? So what to look for in yourself and in colleagues: a change in behaviour, out of character responses, absenteeism, people don't want to come to work, or they're reluctant and or refusing to cover stories. They are just not wanting to do that. And that isn't necessarily a sign that they're lazy and that they've lost interest in the job. It could be that the trauma or the stress of trauma has affected them. They might be making mistakes. They might have impaired judgments. So those are some of the things that you might be looking for. Now, it's important for me to note that I'm not a clinician. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm a journalist with a lot of experience, a passion for this area. So I'm not somebody who's going to be able to diagnose you, but I've got a very good understanding of trauma and journalists. I've got an educated ear and a sympathetic shoulder. Next slide, please. So some of the other things to look for people who might have been exposed to potential traumatic events: trouble sleeping, anxiety, depression, anger and outbursts, nightmares and flashbacks. They are absolutely ticker box categories of what happens when people are traumatized: flashbacks and nightmares. Difficulty concentrating. Now, some of those sort of symptoms, if you like, could explain, all of us all day, every day. So it's something out of the ordinary that we're looking for, something that you may not be able to explain. It's also use and abuse of drugs or alcohol. That's another red flag for potential response to trauma. Risky behavior sexually, or perhaps you might be driving or doing physical things that are dangerous that you wouldn't ordinarily do. You're taking unnecessary risks that you wouldn't ordinarily. It's also sometimes a sign that if you're not wanting to do the usual things that make you happy, or you're cutting yourself off from family or friends, these are the kinds of things that may be an indication that something's not quite right. Hypervigilance, being on edge, that emotional roller coaster. And a lot of that has happened through the coronavirus. So many of us have been in some of this, and that doesn't necessarily mean we've got post-traumatic stress, but it means we are under stress and perhaps being traumatized. Nabil, next slide, please. So why should we be talking about trauma? Well, as Matt pointed out, here in Australia, certainly, there's a legal obligation. Employers have legal obligations, and a lot of, I imagine, the markets that you're in are the same. There's also an ethical duty of care. These are your staff. They might be the people that you've hired casually or as freelancers, but it's your obligation as an employer, as a duty of care. It's good business practice. Healthy journalists mean healthy journalism. And when we take a trauma-informed approach, when we're aware of trauma, and as journalists, we are much more in tune with those people that we've been talking to, and a number of the speakers have alluded to this as well. We get more sensitive and ethical reporting. We make better news choices as news people. The community is better informed, and that means they're more trusting. And let's face it, at the moment, we need all the trust we can get. We're in a time when a lot of people mistrust us as an industry. So it really helps. So next slide, please. When we talk about trauma-informed reporting, here are a couple of tips to ensure that you are better informed about trauma and the people that you might be dealing with. Understand your topic and its consequences. Maybe it's child soldiers, maybe it's a natural disaster. Have a bit of an idea of what you're going into. Explain the news process to those you're interviewing and speaking to. Okay, we're going to do a quick interview here. It's going to be on camera. I'm going to send it back to my base. They're going to do X, Y, and Z to it. Allow them to ask questions about the process, because an important part for people who've been traumatized is to give them control, validate their experiences. And this is a really good way to do it, is show that you're including them in the process. It's important to allow them to set boundaries. Are there questions they don't want you to ask? Are there issues they don't want to discuss? Again, that's about control. And we need to understand that victims can feel shame. They might need time and patience. Nabil, one more, the next slide, please. I know I'm running out of time. So some simple techniques when you're dealing with people who've been traumatized. Listen sympathetically and empathetically. Watch responses. Do they start to dissociate, to sort of look off into the distance? That might be a sign that they're re-traumatizing or not in a good space. So that's when you might want to pause and take a break. Reassure them. A lot of people feel this way as a good technique, good thing to say to people, or reflect back to them. I can see that this is painful for you. Again, it's a validation of their experience. And afterwards, check in that they're okay. You've gone and, wound up all these difficult topics in somebody. You don't want them to just walk away into nothing. So know what they're going into. All right, next slide. And I am very close to the end. So when we talk about building resilience, as news organizations, as colleagues, offer support, whether it's a formal program where there are counselors, psychologists that you can speak to, or a peer-based program where you can talk to your colleagues about their experiences, or whether you offer online resources. It's important to offer those kinds of support. Be proactive. Ask what staff and colleagues need before, during, and after an event. Ensure that senior editors are trauma aware, that they know what to do if they spot a problem and they know what to do with it. And I think we heard Alistair talk about this earlier. Assess what you've been doing, assess it regularly, and tweak as you need. Nothing should be static. Last slide I think we've got now. Thank you all. If you like the work that we're doing at the Dart Centre Asia Pacific, please make a donation. But I've got some good tips I can be giving too on self-care and how to help yourself through times when it's overwhelming. But my time's up now, but I'm happy to have conversations more today or offline for you to contact me. So thank you, everybody. And I do think this is a really, really fantastic initiative. And I thank you all, UNESCO and the other organisations involved.
Thank you so much, Karen. I personally have always been an admirer of what Dart Centre has been doing, and your point about having needing to listen sympathetically, provide reassurance and validations to the interviewees are so crucial, and especially in this region where we are constantly surrounded by natural disasters in addition to man-made disasters. These kind of issues pop up ever so often. And ever so often we see journalists, and this goes higher up in the chain. As you said, the senior editors needs to be involved as well. So all these sensitivities must be inculcated as really as part and parcel of the training and education and practice of day-to-day journalism. So thank you very much. So dear participants, a quick note, a housekeeping note before we move on to the next section of our program today, which is that we are now joined by more participants who have been joining us on Zoom, but also on Facebook Live. So if you have just joined us, please give a quick hello, write it down in the chat box or the comment box, and introduce yourself, where you're from, which organization. And of course, continue to send us your questions. And if you have a specific question to a specific speakers, feel free to indicate so in your message as well. So now moving on to the next part of our program, we have 3 case studies. We will begin with Lanre Arungundad. I apologize for not pronouncing it correctly. The Executive Director for International Press Center in Nigeria, who will be giving us a lot of examples of what's happening at the national level in terms of safety of journalists. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Lanre.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm trying to share my screen. I hope you could see it.
Yes, if you can enlarge that, we will be perfect.
Okay, I'm trying to. Oh, sorry. I'm trying to.
Okay, there you go. Now it's
okay. Okay, thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon to other participants. This is, my name is Lanre Arugundade, and you did try very well in pronouncing my name. I'm the Executive Director of International Press Center, which is based in Lagos, Nigeria. Now, I'm looking at a case study of attacks on journalists during what we call the End SARS protest in Nigeria in October, last year. So this is just a brief case study. Now, by way of introduction, I say here that Nigeria continues to rank among the countries where press freedom and freedom of expression are under threat. As a matter of fact, Nigeria is now regarded as one of West Africa's most dangerous and difficult for journalists to work in because they are often attacked, arbitrarily arrested, or even killed. So that makes Nigeria important when we're talking about press freedom and safety of journalists. Now, a little bit about the End SARS. This was a 19-day protest by youths in Nigeria in October 2020, which drew global attention. And as a matter of fact, given the level of local and international stakeholders that showed interest in that protest, it became the latest protest movement to attract solidarity on a global scale. Basically, this was a protest asked by youths asking for the dismantling of the country's special anti-robbery squad. So that's where you have the acronym SARS, because it had become notorious for extrajudicial killing of young people and other Nigerians. The protest, like I said, was a 19-day one, and it obviously affected the lives and properties of many citizens, including journalists and media organizations who actually faced specific threats, as I will show shortly. And you could see all those symbols of the End SARS protest demanding police brutality. I must say that the media was naturally interested in this protest because journalists too had been subjected to harassment by security agencies, including the police. And in the course of our regular documentations of attacks on journalists in Nigeria, the police have regularly featured as one of the major perpetrators of attacks on journalists. But let's look at what happened in terms of the actual safety issues and threats that were recorded at protests. Now, this data emanates from our organization, that is IPC's Safety Alert Desk. And in the course of that protest, we documented not less than 10 incidents of assault, invasion, brutalization of media and journalists during the End SARS protest. And this include, we have the television Continental, TVC Lagos. This station was attacked and partly burnt by hoodlums on Wednesday, October 21. Journalists and media professionals working in the establishment were also molested by this group of hoodlums. Then Channels Television Lagos had the security personnel attacked. They were assaulted, and the broadcast station had to temporarily halt its activities until the station was put under control. In the part of Nigeria which we call Osun State, a reporter, Tony Yusuf, with the Osun State Broadcasting Corporation, was attacked along with a member of the Nigerian Union of Journalists by angry youths in the course of that protest. Now, I must say that this was a nationwide protest, and so these incidents were recorded in different parts of Nigeria. Then we had the incident involving reporters with the Punch newspapers. Policemen in Lagos State actually tortured the journalists while covering, the EndSARS protests. Then in another part of the country, the Africa Independent Television Station in Benin City was set on fire by hoodlums. And that also led to the halting of the activities of the organization. And that was also on Wednesday, October 21, 2020. Then we also had another incident involving the Osun State Broadcasting Corporation. Like others, the station was also attacked by hoodlums. The gates were destroyed, and a bonfire was built in front of the station on same date. We had the case of Akpokuna or Mafure or Vanguard newspapers. This was in Delta State. Nigeria is a big country. We have 36 states and the Federal Capital Territory. It was brutalized by the police on its way to an official assignment during the curfew imposed by the Delta State government. And that was one of the experiences that was recorded during that protest. Curfews were imposed in some parts of the country, including Lagos. But the understanding was journalists were, frontline workers and they could move. But in spite of that, some of them were attacked. Now, quickly, we also had the incident involving the Arise Television Lagos. The crew of this station were prevented from carrying out their legitimate duty at the Lekki toll gate by a group of soldiers. Lekki was one of the epicenters of these EndSARS protests, as some of you might have read in the news. Now, the Nation newspaper, also in Lagos, was set on fire by hoodlums, and that disrupted the operations of the newspaper for about 24 hours. And then in a very, very saddening case, we had that of Emmanuel Adeyemi, a reporter with Sun newspapers. He was actually hit by a stray bullet, and he died on the spot on his way to the Nigerian Union of Journalists Press Center in Lokoja. Lokoja is a city in the northern parts of Nigeria. It's actually the capital of Kogi State. And in Nigeria, we have the practice where each state chapter of the Nigerian Union of Journalists have a press center where journalists normally converge, and sometimes they use the facilities to spread their news. So these were the incidents recorded. And that leads us to the question of who were the perpetrators. From our own analysis from the safety desk of our organization, we discovered that the main perpetrators, and these were also evident even from the narrative, were hoodlums, security operatives, including the police and the soldiers, angry youths, and of course, unknown, gunmen. I must say that IPC, alongside other groups, condemned these attacks, and we demanded the prosecution, demanded that those who did them should be brought, to justice. Now, the foregoing reveal the kind of threats that journalists could face during protests. And so what do we need to do? And I just have a few tips here as I try to conclude. The first is that we need to eviscerate threats and prepare, meaning that every journalist covering a protest must have the right consciousness, that is the safety consciousness. So that means that we should anticipate attacks. For example, if you work for government media or your media owner has political interests. Now, some of the media houses that were targeted during that protest were owned by politicians. We're not really necessarily saying that that was why, but there's a possibility that there were political undertones to these attacks. It's important to check your health status when you are covering protests. And it's also important to check the scene for possible, escape routes. So we need to build a kind of scenario of, protest scenes before we cover. And obviously, it has been stated often, for coverage of protests, you need to cover from a reasonable, distance. Working as a team, I think, would help during protests, so that if you are attacked, other colleagues could report. You could also share information as much as possible. But I think it's always important to have your identity card on you so that at least you could be easily identified, especially by security agencies. We cannot emphasize enough the importance of being professional, especially applying the principles of conflict-sensitive journalism. Now, that means we need to be diverse and balanced in our reporting. because there could be perception out there that media houses are possibly taking sides with government. We're not saying this was what led to the attacks, but it's a possibility. So the need for factual accuracy and the exercise of discipline of verification during protests is quite important, because during any conflict, including protests, truths, as we say here, is often the first casualty. So it's good for journalists to establish their neutrality. Some of the speakers have said you need contacts. You need to be able to reach important contacts if you are under threat. And that means that for our mobile phones has to be fully charged. You need to have data, airtime, and the rest, of them. And you see the rest, there. So, but for media organizations, I think that it's essential for media organizations to also put in place safety measures for the organization and staff during protests, during conflicts. And this should be adhered to because there is generally increased threats to security in the society. So we think that media organizations also need to take the following into consideration. They need to have an inventory of their staff within and outside the organization, have employee first aid training, conduct safety survey before sending journalists out on protest. It's also important to have a comprehensive insurance for journalists that go out on the field to cover protests, because some of these dangers can actually not be averted, and they need to invest in safety equipment that allows for safe coverage of protests from reasonable distances. And of course, there are other measures that are proposed there because I think my time is running out. But the last point on this page for me is quite important for media organizations to declare their neutrality during conflicts. In the course of reporting protests, we must regularly say that the interest of our respective media organizations is to help the resolution, is to publish the truth, and that we're not necessarily taking sides. I say this advisedly because of the attacks that some media organizations witnessed during the NSAS protests, although we might still need to have a comprehensive case study on this. Finally, for media support groups, organizations like ours, we categorize ourselves as media support groups. I think that anytime there are protests, riots that we know journalists would cover, we also need to anticipate these protests and set up alert systems. We could also issue the advisory. I could recall that during the COVID-19 pandemic last year, IPC did issue a safety advisory for journalists on coverage of COVID-19. So all of us, AIBD, IPC, sometimes we just need to do some quick advisory, just a kind of reminder for journalists to know that they need to be conscious of their safety. And where possible, get together a legal team that could quickly take actions on behalf of journalists that face arrest. In Nigeria, it's common for journalists to be arrested, taken to the police station, and you will need to apply for bail. Sometimes you need lawyers to help you do this. We need to issue statements and organize any needed action, during protests when journalists, come under attack. And more importantly, we need to, as much as possible, document all incidents of these attacks so that we could also do follow-up. Karen talked about trauma and the rest of them. Sometimes we also do not pay enough attention to the psychosocial trauma that journalists who have faced attacks during protests, go through. So often we report, we issue statements, but what happens to these individual journalists on the long run, we hardly know about that. So we need to also invest in that. Thank you very much for your attention. And during the discussion session, we could have more conversation on this.
Thank you so much, Lanre, for your insights on case study in Nigeria. And I appreciate the strong tie back to our first presentation from Alistair, especially regarding the risk assessment and all the plannings that needs to go into place. And this clearly shows that what Alistair have mentioned applies in different countries, including in Nigeria. And I also applaud the idea about the monitoring and the reporting on the violence against journalists and the attacks. And one natural way, since I'm from the UN, I would say that this should be reported to the development under SDG 16.10.1 on the attacks on human rights defenders and journalists. So it is actually a column there that can be reported on. And that's something that the government should be doing. So now moving on to our next speaker, we have from Alexei. from Alexei Orlov, chief of the Russian language version of the Sputnik Radio program. And there he is.
Hello.
So now the time and the floor is yours, Alexei.
Hello and good morning from freezing Moscow to all of you. Thank you so much for this event. I must say it's so great to see people from around the globe at the same moment. Feels like we are surviving the COVID thing and we can see each other again, and that's nice. That's my second time with AIBD conference. I took part in another conference last spring when the COVID started. And I really like what you guys are doing. Special thanks from me for today, for Karen and Philip, for very well-structured lectures. I enjoyed those. But today I would like to concentrate a little bit on a different aspect to make a fresh breath to the whole event, hopefully. My idea is to talk about the safety of journalists when they work and have to deal with the government or local authorities. The main issue here works with basically international news outlets. That's a relatively new story. It's less than half a century old, but nowadays, when more countries are launching their news media around in foreign countries, we see more and more pressure on journalists and on the companies themselves. I work for such company in Russia. Our main brand Sputnik, which is a news agency and a radio, works in dozens of countries, and we face many difficulties, and that happens on a regular basis. So today I would like to pay attention, to draw your attention to some of these stories, and maybe to discuss later where the limit goes between freedom of speech and freedom of journalists and what they are doing, and the right of the government to say, no, that's too much of freedom for you guys. So a very fresh story happened several weeks ago in Latvia, when several Russian language journalists which worked with Sputnik Latvia, they faced charges on breaking the regime, the rules of European Union. And that was all connected to the fact that the chief manager of our company is under personal sanctions in the European Union. Those are personal sanctions, but in Latvia, the government decided that this would be a good reason to say no to the work of the whole agency. And the guys were not even regular staff of the Sputnik agency. They volunteered to write for us, and they are residents of their country, but they could not do their job freely. And they are now under the warrant of no leave, so they cannot leave their home, and they can face either a fine, paying money, or several years of imprisonment. That's not the first case. In June 2019, the mayor of Riga, the capital of Latvia and the biggest city in that region, had to step down. And the reason for that was that he gave an interview with the Sputnik agency just before that. And also back then, last summer in Latvia, the Minister of Foreign Affairs demanded from the local web register, to take down the web resources, which belong, one of them belongs to Sputnik, another one doesn't. But these websites produced information which was not very pleasant to the local government, and it had many critical statements, and there was no other solution, obviously, for the government, but to take the website down. And just briefly, this action breaks Article 11 of EU Charter on Basic Rights, and Article 100 of the Constitution of Latvia. Besides that, the National Council of Latvia on electronic mass media made a recommendation to all media in the Republic not to use photos from the Sputnik agency. But luckily to the audience, to the people in the Republic of Latvia, this recommendation wasn't drawn to law, so at least photos are still to be seen. In neighboring Lithuania, in July 2019, the local Lithuanian Commission on Radio and TV, kind of the local version of Ofcom, demanded to stop access to the Sputnik Lithuania website. The fake reason for that was that one of the articles didn't mention the copyright under the photograph, and when it took several weeks to prove that the accusation wasn't real, and it was taken down then. But still, those were kind of very nervous weeks. To make it more clear, it was the time when in Lithuania they had election campaign and was supposed to elect a new president. When the chief editor of this resource came to Lithuania, he was stopped in airport and was banned from entering the country, even though he himself is a European citizen and doesn't have to have an extra visa or an entry permit. He stayed in the airport being questioned by local authorities for about five hours, and during that time we had no connection, no contact with the guy, and didn't know what was going on. Estonia, another, I'm going in that region so far, just because these countries are close to each other, was the only country where we could have a local office for several years. But it wasn't easy as well, because originally the local bank froze all bank accounts of our employees. And later a Swedish bank, where we could have our money, froze accounts too. So the company had to shut down, and all employees were threatened. They could be imprisoned for cooperating with news outlets from abroad, namely from Russia. It happened more than a year ago, and until now the case hasn't been proven. The people are staying without work, and that's how it's happening. Another example comes from Poland, where local government denounced and took down the press card of our journalist Leonid Sviridov without any explanation. He lost his residence permit and was kicked out of the country. Amazingly and ironically, it all happened a day before the World Freedom of Media Day. He's fighting for his rights now. He's suing the Polish government, but that's not really easy, because he has to stay in a different place, in a different country. Another example with Poland is a local politician, Polish Senator Maciej Grubski, who represents a civil platform party, an opposition party. And he lost his seat in the party and lost his seat as a lawmaker after having an interview with Sputnik. In this interview, he only said that he doesn't consider Russia to be an enemy state to Poland, and as a neighboring country, we need to find ways of mutual cooperation. That was enough to have his documents taken down. I have many more examples, but I see that it takes more time to tell about them than I expected. So I'll probably come to an idea to say that it's quite natural that the government wants to protect its interests, be it France with Yellow Jackets or Germany trying to find the way to control YouTube pages, be it what we see in the US these days when Twitter blocked the president's account. And by the way, months before that, Twitter blocked the accounts of our agency. Not really blocked, but if you search for them, you cannot find them. So they're taken away from the search engine. And this kind of political war is not beneficial for any kind of media. And these days, when we see social media, at least in the US, being more aggressive, we can predict this is a start, just at the moment, a start of a new war with social media when they control more than they probably should. And probably it will end with ban of some social media in some certain countries. Maybe we will see in Russia also the same thing, that we will not have access to Facebook or Twitter at some point. This is not healthy at all. It doesn't help the freedom of speech. It doesn't help any competition of information, and that's very worrying at this point. And the fact that the governments of many countries do not realize the scale of this problem makes us believe that we're yet at the beginning of something that might change the whole profession of journalism in the very near future. That's briefly what I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Alexei, for your various examples, and including from the Balkan countries as well. So thank you very much. And last but not least, we have Dr. Abir Sadi, the journalist, media trainer, and freedom of expression advocate and activist. So I'm sure you have something very interesting to let us know as well from the Middle East. So Abir, the floor is yours.
Yes. I don't know if you see my presentation. Is it appearing in front of you guys now?
You can see it, and if you could just make it full screen, it will be perfect.
I tried yesterday in a training to Bangladesh and Nepal, and it failed. So can I leave it like this?
No problem. We can see it very clearly. Go ahead.
So thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here and hosted by the IPDC, the AIBD, and UNESCO in this very special event. It's very special for me, and thank you for that invitation. I've heard all the speakers and learned a lot from colleagues who work for the safety of journalists. I've been asked to give a case study. I was really thinking between local journalists and the safety of women journalists. So finally, I choose that topic as a case study. And why do we need to talk about gender-based safety if we can? As you said, Dr. Kim, I'm a journalist. I've been working in the field for 29 years, mostly in conflict and war zones within the region in the Middle East and Africa and the south of East of Asia. I've covered things like disasters and all the other things. And then in 2001, I turned into safety training after series of injuries. Hopefully it's not appearing while I'm speaking now, but it really moved me into that sector. And finally, a few years ago to academia, where I did my PhD on journalists working in ISIS controlled regions in the Middle East. So I'm speaking today about the women journalists in particular as a case study, and why we need to talk about their gender-based violence. And those are the sections, and I will be very fast because of time limitation. So where are the women in the conflict, and where are the women in the coverage? Women can be victims like In this photo here, they can be victims. This photo is in Egypt. This is a woman who have been harassed by the army itself. This is another woman who have been participating in the war in Syria, actually not in the side of ISIS, but really against ISIS. But at the end of the day, this is a woman who is militarized. Third kind of women are women who cover those conflicts. And this is very, very important section here. Many of the stories that's covering, for example, gender-based violence are carried by women. However, women journalists themselves face safety threats that can risk reducing their numbers in the journalistic field. This session is about the gender-based violence and safety of women journalists covering those very important events. Actually, here I'm speaking about the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women and peace and security recognition, which is a man and woman experience a war and conflict differently due to their gender role. And women must be involved in all steps of conflict resolution and peace building for peace to be sustainable. And I'm really raising this because I know we're speaking to policy leaders and we're speaking about why women really matters into this. And this is one important thing. This is an international reporter. We know that she was killed in the war in Iraq, in Syria. But as well, journalists can be killed in their own countries. And this is Daphne Galizzi, investigative journalist in Malta, who has been part of the Panama Files investigative reporting. So investigative reporting is a field that can happen cross-border and then can happen inside, and there is the killing. And last year in December 2019, I've been there in the trial in Malta of her, and I hope things go in the right direction. Unfortunately, for Gauri Lankish case study in India, the lack of impunity is still there. Both of them are killed because of their work. Both of them are killed and caused very big sorrow for the family, but still the people who did that are not completely in the place that they deserve for sending this women. In many conflict places, this is Lucy Dossiernet, who filed excellent stories from Afghanistan and the Middle East. She says, in many conflict places I've worked in, Western women have been regarded almost as a third gender. They are not treated as local women. So when women travel internationally, they are treated like that. But actually, when we speak, and especially we're speaking now in COVID case, not everyone can travel. And on the other side, if you are a local journalist and you are a woman as well, the right to choose equals the right to live. When the conflict comes to you, so the conflict comes to you, when the crisis comes to you, when the pandemic comes to you, you should be operating. Some of the people have not even been local journalists. This is Noor Kelzi, who have been a teacher of English in Syria, and she turned to be a fixer for international photographer, and then she became a war correspondent. And this is when they get injured, and then when they get refugees. No one remembers. That's a very bad thing. She got a Courage Award a few years ago, but now she is a refugee here in Cologne. In Germany. But why do we need to talk about women? I think I'll skip that because there's a lot of stories that's very special because women have already put themselves on the map and have been working in this. Layali Abu Leil from Lebanon, she has written excellent story from Al-Mosul. I interviewed her for my PhD because she worked in an ISIS-controlled region. And one of my stories was about mothers who had managed to escape being unable to breastfeed their children while they're doing it. And whether those mothers are from the people themselves or from the ISIS women, it's still, there are cases, and those women, she was able to get stories many of the male reporters cannot have. Another one is the band Beauty, which was done by Heba Khamis in Cameroon. So women, mothers have to really iron the breast of their daughters in order not to get raped. This story caused this reporter to get cholera, malaria, and she stayed there for months until she was getting this story. Luckily, she was an award winner after this, in this age, which is very good. So the resolution of 1325 of the UN said so. So that's an important thing for policy leaders. Another thing is the UNESCO framework for gender sensitive indicators for the media, which is action foster equality in media and action to foster gender portrayal in media content. This is another woman from Iran where the military parade happened, the attack happened, and she was, Fatma Rahmanoff was able to get those photos. Many, this is Karima from Syria, all of them, I'm very honored that I really was the trainer of those wonderful women, and they allowed me to take their stories and really put it in the safety handbook that was for International Association of Women Radio and Television, and was really supported by UNESCO and other organizations. So some journalists were not even war correspondents, but they were local correspondents, and then they went to the regional and covered regional conflicts like the Egyptians going to Libya and the others. And we are speaking today and now after 10 years of the so-called Arab Spring, and there are all those journalists, they lost, some of them lost their jobs, some of them really suffering. This is a journalist that was kidnapped during Shaima, during the coverage. I'm not going to go through this because you can still go to my book and find all the things regarding this. So some women are arguing that their experience are not different than the male experience and that they still have the attacks and they have the things further as the attacks. Actually, that's a big argument. I'm not going to go through this, but I will say that something like harassment happens to male and female, but it happens more. UNESCO now is conducting the biggest online harassment study. And I think some very serious, important indicators have been shown now. This is Lara Logan in Tahrir Square in Egypt. How can women journalists increase their safety when working in the field? And what should we consider when we design and implement a project of a program that address safety of women? That's a very important issue. One thing to remember, to involve every stakeholder when you do this. It's not only training, although training is a very essential thing. A Sudanese journalist told me she visited a conflict zones despite being in a high risk stage of her pregnancy to prove to her boss that she deserved the post. As you see, women journalists, they have to really fight against the system and to fight for their safety and to fight for not being harassed. And some of those harass happens in the office. And I'm telling you, the Me Too campaign is never finished. And especially in our region, in the Middle East, there are still a lot of cases. Training, this is some photos from some trainings that we're doing. This is the safety handbook. We have first done it in the Philippines, actually in 2017, and it was attended by UNESCO representative. Everything is great. The Philippines is not great, actually. I'm sorry, because during this particular pandemic, we have been fighting for our colleagues, Francia, who was taken. She's in a community radio, and community media is a very important media. She was taken and detained during covering the 1st of May demonstrations in that last year in 2020. Another journalist, Lady Anne, who was really campaigning for her colleague, was detained in December, where a lot of attacks around the world happened. In Afghanistan, now we are very concerned about many women journalists, and the assassination started, the campaign that is happening now in Afghanistan, happening by started by the assassination of a female journalist. We're not going to speak now about the importance of women journalists in the field, but we are going to speak more about the lack of impunity, about the lack of jobs because of the pandemic. They lost a lot of jobs. Actually, the most number, and I was hoping to get numbers today, but I'm promising I will try and get this and send it to Nabil. So practical training, even those kind of trainings that we have been doing in the field, this is not available now. But what we cannot talk all, don't let it all. This is a Syrian training. This is a TOT training that happened a few days ago. How did it happen? Because we trained journalists inside Syria to give this kind of training. I'm glad that I was part of this, but I hope, and this is another one that's happening in Iraq. We can't reach those people now, but at least they can conduct their own training. We have to empower them. There should be like grants for those local training happening. Online training should really very much be developed. I have to conclude here because I noticed the time, But I'm really very interested in the session, and maybe in the Q&A we can speak more about this issue and other issue. But always remember, local journalists, citizen journalists, freelance journalists, and of course the women journalists. Thank you very much for that. I'm concluding. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Abir. That was fascinating. And indeed, most journalists killed, according to the reports gathered by UNESCO since 2006, more than half of them happened in the so-called peacetime countries. So there's no active war that's happening. So most journalists are killed in peacetime country. And what you have said about women journalists is completely true. We often say that women journalists face double attacks, first as a journalist, then as a woman. And then that's and the recent global survey that you have mentioned also indicate that a lot of women experience harassment in their office, in their media organization, but they don't report it always because most of them believe that even if they report it, nothing will happen by their management. So that is certainly something that is very, very troubling because the company that you work for must protect you regardless of the gender. So that is certainly something that hopefully the result of the global research, which is now available to anybody who wants to just Google it, it's there and could perhaps be used as a basis for policy. Better policy by media organizations. So, dear speakers and our dear participants, we have come to the end of the presentation part of the event. And now we are moving towards the discussion and then merging it with the Q&A with the participants. So perhaps if all the speakers could turn on their cameras and be ready to take on some questions, that will be great. The organizers have already lined up some questions collected from the chat rooms from both Facebook as well as Zoom. And we will go through them as well. But perhaps while waiting for more questions to come in from the participants, I would just like to perhaps get some, your thoughts a little bit based on all the discussion that we had and your presentation. Perhaps I could just start with a couple of questions just to get the ball rolling. And let's see. I'm still very curious about the changing of culture, which was something that we talked about in the beginning. And as we know, changing culture is perhaps one of the larger, if not the most difficult challenges when we try to make a change, a substantial change. So perhaps this question can go to Alistair, Karen, and even and also Matt. So what are the challenges that you face when you are starting to build this new culture of sharing of information, this change the culture to be always have preparedness in your mind? So what are the challenges that you see, you saw, and that you perhaps could have, that you overcame and people eventually change their culture and their mindset? So Alistair, Karen, who is currently online, if you could share with us.
I'd be happy to take that one on.
Okay,
I think one
Karen,
of the,
you go
yeah,
first,
one of the issues is, you know, commitment through an organization is that, you know, sometimes some managers say, yes, this is how we want things to be, and it just doesn't filter through. And that's not just big organizations. I'm formerly from the ABC, but it's other organizations as well. There's a, you know, somewhat lip service to this kind of practice, but the reality is quite different. And also the people they expect to take on those jobs usually have, you know, too many other things to do as well. One of the things I would like to see us doing is, you know, that very detailed documentation that we saw Matt have. I would like to see us do something similar on the psychological harm that stories can, because they're all part and parcel. The safety of your people when they're in the field is, doesn't really mean anything if you're not looking after them when they're out of the field, they're home, and they're dealing with whatever it is, whether it's demons or things coming back to them or not adjusting very well. So I would like to see us take a much more detailed approach to that. But I think there's very often a real disconnect between what organisations and people say they want to do and what they are actually prepared to do. So while we are making progress, I think we've got a long way to go, and particularly because we're still a very male-oriented, male-dominated field, that there's still this inability to admit that there's a problem, that toughen up princess kind of attitude that is really not very helpful. But I think the way to convince people is that, they might be sued, so there could be financial liabilities. And really, you're looking after people. You need to actually understand that people's lives are at stake here, not just physically when they're out in the field, but after the fact. We know that there's self-harm, that people can have destructive behaviour after they've been in conflict zones and difficult situations. So, so that would be my 2 cents worth.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. That's very important points about the commitment from higher up, and that really make a change. So Alistair and then Matt, perhaps just to have your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I'd really endorse all that was said there. I think one of the issues, as well as the scale of the topic, is that if you want to change the culture, it's not something you're going to do in 5 minutes. And so Karen's point about the sort of people may say things and then not actually action them is very important. And in my presentation at the start, I said one of the things that was required was the planning, the infrastructure. And what I meant by that is allocating resources, people's time, money, responsibility, to make sure that people are working towards this culture. I think another thing is, to mix all my metaphors up, is that you can't eat an elephant, but you cut it down to small enough parts, then you can ultimately get there. For things that you can change, then repackaging it to see the worth in change. That if somebody is ill, injured, is unable to work, the cost to the organisation of that, let alone legal side of things, but just in lost opportunities and lost work. So it's packaging that all together, I would suggest, to try and gradually move this stone in the right direction.
Thanks, Alistair. And Matt?
Yeah, I think, organisations, including ours, have come a long way from just, head out there to having a greater duty of care and exercising that and acknowledging it, but also acknowledging that, we work in 10 different jurisdictions. So acknowledging that obligation and trying to live up to it in those places in all sorts of different ways. I just wanted to touch on the gender issue. It was something that wasn't particularly well addressed until a couple of years ago. It was feedback we had from one of our hostile environment courses. A young woman who was going out to South Asia said, how come we don't talk about that? And of all the things that there were for me to address, I thought, half the world's population, let's have a conversation around that. So, now we have in our sort of ready reckoner of tasks and hazards, we actually have gender hazards there, and obviously there's a high risk, and we add to this when people come back from assignments and they make suggestions. So we now have ready reckoners. We have done a couple of workshops with people specifically focused on gender hazards and what women and other team members can do to deal with it. And we've been sure to focus not just on what you might think of as external threats, bad people out there doing things to our team, but to make sure that the team itself is reminded that all of the ways you are legally required and morally required to behave as a team don't change when you head out the door, because I think that's something that happens as well, that sometimes people think they're out in the Wild West and they can behave differently. So yeah, we've done quite a bit of work on that. you know, just addressing as a team the very important issues around gender-based hazards, and sexual harassment and assault.
Thank you so much. So that's a great segue to a couple of questions. So I'm going to just merge these several questions into one, which is, in your experience so far, what are some of the best practices and good practices from different media organizations and all the way to government and ministries that you have seen that have really made an impact that that you would like other countries and other media organizations to use and to learn from? Anyone? Maybe Lanre, any examples from Lanre and Abir exactly specifically?
Sure. Okay, thank you very much. Well, this is not specifically about protests, but about elections. And I think we have one or two best examples from West Africa. Prior to the last general elections in Sierra Leone, and I think this was also tried in Liberia, the media organizations, had a kind of engagement with the security agencies, in particular the police. I also think this happened in Ghana, where they had a dialogue on, the problems on both sides. Journalists, why they always have problems with security agents in the course of covering elections. And then on the side of the security agencies, the problems that they think they have, with the media. Now, at the end of that, dialogue, they produced something like a memorandum of relationship, during the elections, which, highlights steps that each side could take to minimize, conflicts, and including information, detailed information on which police officers to contact if you have, challenges, how to relate, with policemen and the rest of that. So we need to have, more of these kind of engagement or dialogue with the security agencies, and where possible, maybe depending on specific situations, have a kind of, memorandum of understanding. But even if you don't have, a formal document, I think it's good for us to know from their own, perspectives, what exactly is the issue, why, they repeatedly attack, journalists on legitimate, duty, especially during, protests, coverage of the pandemics and the rest of them. We need to do, more of this, and we can then share such information and knowledge with our colleagues on the field. And I think that could, be helpful. But the other one, which, well, we still don't have, that model. And I think that we need also to begin to look at possible engagement with individual media organizations to see what kind of, safety measures that they could put in place. And that become like a model which we could then, sell or, share with other, media organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Lanre. And how about you, Abir? What have you seen that could be considered as a good practice that all of us should do?
Actually, the example that I'm getting is from Afghanistan, for example, Najiba Al-Qalyoubi, who is the head of the killer group. She's a manager of the killer group, and she have created some policies related to safety of the people. Najiba herself have been tried to being assassinated several times, and one of the radios or two, I think ISIS and Al-Qaeda exploded them. So she's trying to create this, and she's trying to do some gender-based safety as well, which is a very good thing. And this is a good example of when women are in managerial level, although they are very few, but they are good examples. But I have been, vice president of the Egyptian Journalist Syndicate for 9 years. Before and during the Egyptian revolution. And the thing that I found and lesson learned, of course, from a country like Egypt is that it has to be inclusive policies. That is a very important thing, not to neglect anyone, have to classify the kind of journalists you have in the country. Not only the journalists working in the media itself, you have to put into consideration that these policies can be involved with the unions. In some countries that I've trained in, like in Bangladesh, for example, I've been training several trainings in Bangladesh. during the times of COVID, now there is a curfew. Only the journalists who have a really recognized ID can go through. But the photographers there have a very successful thing. They gather together and they are trying to take those courses internationally, speaking to others. We as GMIC Center, we gave them one course, other courses. And at the same time, now they are trying to negotiate for their existence, because photojournalists are one of the people who really suffer very much with this pandemic. So what I see, insurance company as well, because no one mentioned that in the presentation, that's a very important issue. Lots of insurance are not covering the disaster, including a pandemic, okay? So for example, in country like Egypt, do you know, guys, like we have lost the lives of 18 journalists in Egypt, including 6 women, and all the people that I know, and I know I've been a union for 40,000 journalists, and I know, like, for example, more than 100 of my colleagues got COVID. Who is going to insure this? Who is going to insure the journalists who lost their jobs because of the pandemic? That's a very important issue when we have to do this. Another thing, because we have Kelly here from the Dart Center, and I really, Karen, I admire you. We want organization like Dart Center to give more grants. So we hire more grants for the journalists who are freelancers, who are local journalists, and women journalists, of course, because those ones really matter. The thing that I can do personally is things like the safety handbook. I've never taken any money for that book. And during the pandemic, we have translated into different language and it's open. So those resources as well should be available and should be for free. No money to be taken about that. Anyone wants to publish them, to print them, but just put their name, that would be great. Thank you.
Can I just pick up on some of what Abir has had to say? I think it's really amazing that, you've got that workbook, and I would love to get a copy for sure. I think one of the things that can be done, and look, I'll take on board the grants. I can't say that. It's not my place to say that, but we do understand the need for this. It's a matter of how we pay for it, because we are a small organisation with limited resources, but it's something we're very aware of. We know there's a lot of need. We want to do something about it. I think what needs to happen is that we shouldn't be always relying on governments and big organisations. There's a lot that can be done unofficially. A number of the programs I've done with the Dart Center in New York at Columbia University, their graduate school of journalism, where we discuss and sort of share ideas about how we can help one another. One of the things was raised with one of the fellows last year was a buddy system, was having a PTSD buddy, that you actually have somebody who's your go-to person to talk to about PTSD or what you're going through. But that can be said there, and there are informal networks of journalists, photographers, etc., who are in disaster zones, who all look out for one another, and it's usually volunteers, etc. There's a lot of those networks. It would be great, as I think it was Surya was telling about this media safety center, that could be something that is propagated through there. So if you can't do a formal peer support network like the ABC has, and it has a world-class peer support network, then you can be doing things informally. So I think that that's something that we can be looking at. But look, Abir, I would love us to have an offline conversation. I think we've got a lot that we can share. So let's get each other's coordinates and talk more about this. And anybody, I'm happy to have conversations with anybody and everybody about any of these issues. I'm very passionate about it, and I'd love to be able to share information.
Thank you so much. And indeed, these are one of the reasons why we have events, so that we can actually spark more discussions post-event. And both you and Abir have already touched on something that several of the questions from the participants have also asked. What can they do individually? And some of the questions relate to what can we do individually while waiting for governments and organizations to help us in terms of strengthening our emotional courage or support. And also Abir has already touched on safety, but perhaps our other speakers, if you have something to add, what can a journalist, with or without their support system from the organization, do starting from today and tomorrow to improve their safety? Perhaps Philip, and then Matt, and then Alexei, or Alistair to chip in?
Hi. So from my end, it's more on the digital safety. So I would suggest that, when you get hold of my slides, I've given some good recommendations there. Things like start looking at things like encryptions, start looking at things like, secure storage. There are a lot of things which is available, but we don't use. For example, when you look at encryption, like when you use secure messaging, WhatsApp uses secure messaging. They claim they use secure messaging, which is yes, they use end-to-end encryption. Telegram also use encryptions and all this. But we need to do some check and look at those applications and see things like, for example, if they say they do end-to-end encryption, do they actually have access to the keys, the encryption keys? Because if they still have access to the encryption keys, then it comes back to the same that, hey, I can still get your data from you. That's why a lot of people are migrating to Signal, because it's more of the open source where they don't hold the keys. So we need to look at options. Options are there. There are a lot of good options out there. It's a matter of knowing where they are and which one to use for secure communication. For example, like, Wire and Telegram have been using disappearing messages, secret chats for a very long time already, which WhatsApp just started. So use things like that to do. And the second thing I would really, really want to say, which I didn't get a chance to show earlier, is how to keep, do not disclose your location. So go back to your mobile phone, disable location services, only allow when you're using certain apps when necessary. Other than that, do not switch it on, because everything is tied to it. I would love to show it to you, because you can see that even when you take a photo with the location services on, you can actually use an app to extract your exact GPS location on the map. Okay, that's how much of details a photo gives out in terms of its metadata. So, so you need to look at all these things. Like I said earlier, less is good. So know what to use very as much encryption as possible. Look at things like virtual private networks, keep yourself safe, and then protect your sources, protect your communication, protect your storage, and protect your location as well. And then and if you need any assistance, I'm more than happy to take this offline. Thanks.
Thank you, Philip. And of course, metadata was one of the stories that, one of the issues that we started talking about from a couple of years ago. Why it's so important? Because with metadata alone, big data company can track where you have been, which hospital you have gone to, which shop do you go to. So all the personal detail that even though you do not actually put in those exact addresses, they can know and they can target your habit because of that. So those are just one of the reasons why metadata protection is so important. Alistair, Matt, Alexei? Yes, Alistair.
Yes, so going back to your question about the individual, my presentation, I spoke about planning, I spoke about risk assessment, but that isn't something that should only kind of come down from above. That in a large organization, yes, there has to be managerial buy-in, cultural shift. We've talked of that already. But the individual has, I would say, a responsibility as well, and needs to be involved in it as well, because ultimately, if something goes wrong, it's that individual that's got more at stake, I would say, than perhaps someone sitting in a newsroom 4,000 miles away. So we need to have an honesty with ourselves and think through, what is it that we're thinking that we're going to be doing? What's this assignment involve? Audit ourselves perhaps about our skills, our capabilities, our health, our mental health towards this topic. Work to prepare ourselves, and we're now all familiar with the concept of training online. There's many opportunities to broaden our skills and knowledge, and there's also an opportunity to broaden our networks through events like this. That idea of a buddy care, we talk about it from a physical point of view, particularly when you're in things like cold environments, but it's also from a mental point of view as well, having someone that you can speak to. So I think there's a lot an individual can do. In organizations, they shouldn't be doing it by themselves. They should be supported by the organization. But I do think it's beholden on the individual to think, Where am I going? What do I need to be doing this effectively? What can I do to improve my preparation for this?
Thank you, Alistair. Alexei?
I would like to add a little bit to Philip, because Telegram is a big thing in Russia these days, and it's probably the main source to send any kind of any means to send any kind of information you want to be public. These days we see it's not only about journalists, it's a growing fear among population not to share too much information with anybody and with the government. So people move from WhatsApp to other messengers, and Telegram. The story with the Telegram here in Russia is probably it was created by a Russian national, and the government tried to get the keys from the messenger for long. It was actually blocked in Russia for 2 years officially, but eventually they couldn't do it, so they had to let it go. So far it seems to be the safest means to correspond, but my suggestion is never trust just one, and maybe split kind of information in different ways of communication, be it email or some other stuff. And the best way is, of course, word of mouth. So meet people rather than email them or call them.
Good old fashioned. Okay, now, so in true fashion of mediated communication, the last 20 seconds to you, Matt, and you have the last word.
Okay. Well, I think the digital space is obviously important. We keep coming back to that. There are organizations like the Electronic Frontiers Foundation, Committee to Protect Journalists. And whilst the others were talking, I just did a quick Google, just Google journalist safety, and surprise, surprise, you'll get a whole lot of stuff from UNESCO. So a lot of the detailed things that we've got on our in-house documentation, I've looked through UNESCO publications, and there's a huge amount of really detailed resources there that give you guides to safety in the field. Most of all, though, by and large, in pretty much every jurisdiction I know of, journalists are not a special category. They're just people. And it's about the rights of people to go and ask questions, to go and talk to people and to tell stories. And so I think that underlying all of that is that basic right to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. So we come back to those essential human rights. Some of us have passes, some of us have rich organizations behind us, but ultimately all of us are just people with pens, typewriters, laptops, and cameras and microphones. And it's to respect everyone who wants to tell their story.
Thank you so much. And I couldn't have said it better. And it is especially true even nowadays during a crisis, COVID-19 pandemic, the right for an individual, including journalists, to collect information, to share information, and to receive information is protected under International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that right is protected, and no government can use COVID-19 as an excuse and a crisis as an excuse to block that. Yes, there are consideration for safety, there are consideration for making sure that the process itself is safe for both sides, for everyone, but those are just procedures. But the right and the fundamental right itself is always there, and I couldn't agree more. And with that, I think we will end our session today. For that, yes, who is that?
Lanre from Nigeria.
Yes, Lanre, go ahead.
Just on your question, I think what we need to tell all journalists is that safety is first and foremost a personal issue. It should also be seen as a professional issue. So it should be part of our day-to-day practice as journalists. Just like we talk about the fact that journalists must verify, must fact check, must investigate. it's the same way of saying you must also be aware, of your, safety. And just like the last speaker said, there are so many resources out there on safety. So it's an individual thing. And if you take it that way, if you are being asked to cover, dangerous assignments or protests, which was my case study, you then have the right to ask your media organization, to to provide necessary, safety tools, for you. Now, some of the participants have asked questions on what can they do. They don't have all these things in place in their respective organizations. My suggestion would be that you need to work with the organizations that represent the interests of journalists in your establishment. In Nigeria, we have the Nigerian Union of Journalists. We also have the Nigerian Guild of Editors. All these professional bodies must be part of this. And I think that together we can work with individual media organizations to encourage them to put some of these things in place. So we must take it as a duty to advocate for some of these things, and then hopefully we'll see a number of media organizations adopting policies that enhance the safety of journalists. But like I said, it's an individual thing. So you must be aware of your health status and where you're being asked to cover assignments that may jeopardize your health. If you're an asthma patient, for example, is it advisable to cover a protest where tear gas might be fired? And if you would have to go, wouldn't you need some medications? All these things are quite important, and we cannot emphasize it enough. Have safety consciousness. Thank you.
Absolutely. It starts from the individual and it goes higher and up. And is the old saying, stronger together applies equally in the terms of safety of journalists. But in the end, it does start from the individual. And we hope that working together by participating in this kind of sharing of experiences, exposing us to the resources, including from UNESCO, which all of it is freely online in multiple languages. If there's a specific language that you need that is not already online, let us know. We will try and translate that as well. And there's so much more that we can discuss, and we hope we would like to have more time. Unfortunately, we are running out of time already. Before we end, we will take a group photo, but I'll leave that up to Nabil from AIBD to instruct us on how to do that. So thank you so much, all our speakers for today. Your insights and your experience has been wonderful, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of the organizers as well as the participants that we have indeed learned something new today for all of us. And as Karen have said, I hope that you will continue your conversations and discussions and idea sharing beyond this forum, and hope that we will have time to an opportunity to connect in the future, and not just virtually, but a mix of virtual and real soon. And that, I think, is the hope for the entire planet. So with that, I pass it back to AIBD colleagues, Nabil and also Philo. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meng. Indeed, it was information-packed session, and definitely the response.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. And the response what we are getting from Facebook and Zoom definitely is quite encouraging. And I believe that there were so many questions by the participant attendees. So we will be we are copying them to the speakers, and if they are willing, they will definitely get back to us, and we will be sending to you those responses as well. And also we will be sending the recording and the presentations via email or whatever you have registered on the registration form. So now we can have a group photo, and moment. So 1, 2, 3. Wow, first click, perfect click. So thank you. So now I would like to invite again to give back the control of the grid to Miss Philomena. Miss Philomena, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nabil. And, I've been having a very interesting 2 hours and 40 minutes session of listening to safety on journalists, right? And hearing so many good stories. And I think there's certainly room for doing more of this, right? So I'd like to thank very much Dr. Min Kok Lim. I think this is his area. And, he moderated so well. And all the chats that I'm seeing, I'm seeing photojournalists. We also have Paula Slyer. We have Shahidul Alam from Bangladesh. Everyone has sort of joined in this conversation, and it just shows how interested people are on this topic. So I would like to say thank you and look out, because AIBD is going to do safety for journalists together with IPDC UNESCO until September. So there's a chance for everyone to get involved. Thank you also to Lanre from Nigeria and Alexei, Matt, Dart Center, Karen, right? And also from Egypt. Thank you so much, all of you. Abir, you shared a lot of interesting stories. Really happy to have all of you on board. And Philip, I'm definitely going to check my internet settings on my phone. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day and stay safe. Thank you.